Back again with another episode of the C-Suite with I-Team lead investigator Chris Nakamoto. And, you know, Carolyn Coleman was here last week, so you have a tough act to follow, my friend. She was something else. But listen, it's good to have you back here again. I wish it was under more jovial circumstances. Obviously, you have been really a lead in giving information to the public about the death of this young man, Caleb Wilson, and 3 arrests have been made. So let's talk about this. I had the police chief on the show to talk about it, but in a smaller amount of time. From your perspective, take us through the saga that led to the death of this young man.
Yeah, certainly a awful tragedy.
Mm-hmm.
I can't even imagine what the family's going through. This all started on February 26th when a bunch of pledges and fraternity members from Omega Psi gathered at a warehouse that was being leased by the father of one of the fraternity members.
Mm-hmm.
They do this fraternity ritual where they make all the pledges stand in a line, and one individual starts punching the first group, a second individual starts punching the second group. Caleb was among the second group. He collapses after getting 4 blows to the chest while the fraternity members were wearing boxing gloves. He collapses to the floor, has a seizure. They wind up changing his clothes and then loading him into a vehicle, bringing him to the hospital. The hospital, they unload his unresponsive body. The hospital calls police, and that's how this investigation starts. As the hospital starts, looking at this death, obviously it's suspicious. You have a young man who's unresponsive, doesn't make any sense. So in their right minds, they call police. Police launch this investigation. They're told by the fraternity members after they trace down whose car it belonged to, because they dropped Caleb off and took off.
Yeah.
And so there was no way of knowing who these people were. So they had to find out what vehicle he was in. Then they start asking questions. And then this lie begins to be told that they were at this park and playing basketball when Caleb collapsed.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't until our sources reached out to us and told us they weren't at a park. They were actually at this warehouse when they collapsed. They were punching the pledges, and that's essentially what happened. And so we break that story on Mardi Gras Day, and it just snowballed from there.
So I'm going to jump forward and then jump back as it relates to this story. We'll go back to the incident in question, but you mentioned the warehouse. How'd you find the warehouse?
So we had gotten a tip from our sources that, hey, look, they were at this warehouse. Here's the address, go start looking into it. So we show up at the warehouse, and the warehouse is set up with A, B, C, D, E suites. So we didn't know when we showed up and got this address to this warehouse which suite he was in at the time that this hazing took place. So we start just knocking on doors and starting to talk to all the people that are there. And one of the guys says, oh yeah, police were here Monday, as a matter of fact, going around looking for surveillance video. And so I said, well, where were they? And he said, well, I don't know. So then we started talking to other business owners, and they were like, oh, they were at that one. So I walk over to that one, and I see 2 different signs on the door. And I'm like, let me start calling these numbers. So I start calling the numbers, and one of the individuals who picks up the phone starts talking to me about it. And he was like, I don't know what you're talking about. But I could tell that the person knew me, but I couldn't recognize the voice on the other end of the phone. It was Councilman Cleve Dunn.
Right.
And Cleve Dunn said, look, I had no idea that this had happened here, but I'm going to get to the bottom of it. He gets his business partner on the phone, who
Right then and there,
okay, while I'm there on the phone, and we do a 3-way call. And Todd Smith admits to me, yeah, police have been asking questions. His son is an Omega, and basically he was told that they were at that warehouse. And that was the first that Cleve had learned about it.
Yeah, I saw the headline, I guess early last week, and read it maybe last Wednesday. And I read the entire story, and the way the story laid out seemed completely plausible to me that from Councilman Dunn's perspective, he did not know. Did you get the same impression?
Absolutely. Councilman Dunn was very forthcoming and made it very clear to distance himself from Todd Smith and say, I had no idea. At minimum, I should have had a courtesy call knowing that I'm co-leasing this business with you, outside of this warehouse, and the police are coming asking questions and you don't even tell me about it.
Yeah.
So you could tell he was pretty perturbed by not getting a phone call.
So that deals with you finding the warehouse and then also talking to the ownership of the warehouse. So let's go back to the incident in question. I had the chief on the show, and I know that he's charged 3 of the young men involved with that. And, obstruction and the perpetrator. I did ask him, what about the other young men who were in the room? Why were they questioned? Why weren't they charged? And he said it was because when Caleb collapsed, as they understand it, the rest of the pledges were ushered into another room while what went on after he collapsed happened. They changed his clothes and then put together this story about how this happened. Has that been consistent with what you have heard as well?
Yes, it has been. And also, too, when you look at it, like the pledges, they can really be seen as victims.
Yeah.
From what we understand, they didn't have phones. So they're sitting here being punched by these fraternity members, at least 3 that we know of that threw the punches. The other individuals that are there, we're told, did not throw punches at the pledges. But the 3 who did punch the pledges are being criminally charged, 2 with hazing, 1 with manslaughter. And the one that's being charged with manslaughter, from what the warrants say, is the one who hit Caleb. And so all of this was gleaned through interviews from people that were there that night. And that's how they were able to determine what the truth actually was.
Have you spoken to his family at all?
Yes, I have. And
is there anything about that you can share? I'm sure there's things you probably don't want to share. But
they're distraught, as you can imagine. It's been an extraordinary ride. They're sitting here, getting more information from the media than they were detectives. And so we're publishing information and they're learning about what happened through the media versus hearing it from the detectives doing the investigation. I understand you got to protect the integrity of the investigation, but they had to know as well that this was going to get out. So they probably should have been a little bit more forthcoming with the family. Also, it took more than a week for them to get the body back. So
why was that? Why do you know why that was?
Yes. Okay. So the autopsy results were initially inconclusive.
Okay.
So with that being,
is that because of a toxicology report or them being able to ascertain what made him collapse?
Right. So the autopsy revealed he had a small bruise on his chest.
Okay.
But outside of that, everything else was inconclusive.
Okay.
There was no physical trauma to his body. And so they did an initial tox screen, from what I'm told, which showed absolutely nothing in Caleb's system. But the official tox screens can take, we're told, upwards of 60 days to come back.
Okay.
But while they were doing additional testing, I should say, that's why they couldn't release the body back to the family. So the family's learning all this information. They don't have his body. They can't even grieve, really, because they haven't had a funeral. So you just can't even imagine the situation that they're in, having their loved one who was a bright light in this world, mechanical engineering student, member of the world-famous Human Jukebox.
That's right.
Gone after just 2 decades on this earth. It's hard to fathom.
You and I are both fathers, and I can't understand the emotion that they must have gone through first receiving the information, right, that their child is no longer going to be here, and then going through this entire process. In terms of dealing with families who have lost loved ones on college campuses, is there anything that you have learned about how these processes work?
I mean, you think about it, you try to nurture your kids, right?
Yeah.
You nurture them, you send them off to college, and then you want them to spread their wings, right? You don't expect them to die while they're in college. And I think District Attorney Hiller Moore put it best. He said, you want them when they go to college to come home with a black cap and gown, not leave in a black body bag.
That's right.
And I think it doesn't resonate more than hearing a situation like that when you have this family that is so well-to-do in the New Orleans area. You have 2 communities that are grieving.
Oh, yeah.
In the most populated area of the state.
That's right.
Baton Rouge and New Orleans.
That's right.
Because he was a Kenner native.
That's right.
And so you have 2 communities with a huge population that are grieving the loss of this young man. And this goes beyond just New Orleans and Baton Rouge. The whole state is interested. The whole nation.
The nation is too.
We're told fraternities around the nation now are having conversations about putting some of their rituals on hold if they know that it involves hazing as a result of Wilson's death.
What did you learn about that? Because I know that the fraternities and sororities want to address this. I've spoken to people who have wanted to speak out about this, but most of them are exhibiting restraint because, A, they just got the body of this young man back. I don't even know if they've had services for him yet. Now's not the time to do butt coverage over what does and doesn't happen at these fraternities. But what are you hearing locally here from membership about the way forward and how they never do this again.
Well, I'm hearing there's a lot of conversations. If you know that this is a ritual that your fraternity typically does, nobody wants to make the limelight like Omega Sci-Fi has.
Yeah.
And let me preface it by this. There are no winners in this case.
No.
You have 3 young men that are now charged
That's right.
with criminal hazing, which are felonies.
Yeah.
And you have another individual, criminal hazing plus manslaughter. If he's convicted, he could potentially get 40 years in prison.
Yep.
Do I think he woke up that morning and said, I want to kill somebody today?
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not.
No.
And his future as well is also on the line as a result of a poor decision that was made. So these are conversations that fraternities are having to have, because at the end of the day, no one wants to throw away a life. And that's what's happening here.
That's great perspective.
And in addition to that, even the ones that are charged with criminal hazing, like even though they didn't necessarily punch Caleb according to the warrants, they were punching other pledges.
Yeah.
Now their names are out there, their mugshots are out there. Can you imagine, Clay? Like if they wind up not getting convicted for
it's still out there because you're going to Google. People are searched now. This is the world we're in.
The internet lives on forever.
That's right.
And so this is now something that will follow them for the rest of their lives.
Yeah.
Even if the crimes they're charged with, they're not convicted of, even if they're convicted of something far less.
Yeah.
This will follow them for the rest of their lives. And it's going to be difficult for them to find a job, to find work, they will be known as the person and people that hazed those pledges that night. Yeah. And so when you think about it like that, there are no winners.
Not one. So, before I leave this, I don't think people understand from the inside of our industry what it's like when you're fielding calls and consuming this information before you go to television. Like, you spend weeks working on this. You've got 3 to 4 minutes in a news package or in a stand-up to convey the information and the totality of a story. But at the same time, you had to have had some emotions yourself about what happened to this kid, this young man.
100%. You look at him, you see the videos of him playing the trumpet in church, and you watch him, this bright, light in this world that's extinguished. And then you get the tip about what happened to him. And it's almost like you're incredulous, right? Because that can't be right. So you get the tip, and then you're like, I need to verify this because it just seems so specific, but also so outrageous that they would make up this extraordinary lie. And so then you start calling other people, and they say, yeah, no, that's what happened. And they're like, all right, here we go. Yeah. And then we publish it, and then soon all the other news organizations followed suit.
It's so crazy. So it's been, we're midway now through the last month of the first quarter. So you've had the first quarter here at AFB. Of all the stories that you have done so far, does any one or two stand out to you as like, okay, that's the best ones I've done so far? And best, please don't, I'm not trivializing the stories, because this one with Caleb is a very important one. Not that you're enjoying the process, but the importance of it. So what ranks 1, 2, and 3 in that line?
I feel like we've really hit the ground running. We said that we had a lot of stuff that needed to be covered, and I feel like, we've really delivered in terms of doing a lot of investigative stories.
No doubt.
I think some of the stories that we did that are really interesting that could potentially cause a change or lead to a change is one of the first stories we did, compensating convicts. There's a number of convicts that are currently in prison that taxpayers are paying their pensions. And I think a lawmaker had told us after the story aired, he's going to propose or look at possible legislation to clean that up so that it doesn't happen again in the future. Because, you're convicted, and, the taxpayers are now paying for your room and board, basically. And they're also giving you a check. Jack Strain's a prime example, convicted of rape, and, the St. Tammany Parish Sheriff. And he's, sitting in prison collecting almost more than $7,000 a month. Like, it defies logic.
Jeez.
So that's one of them.
Okay.
Another one that we did that was kind of a day of type story was we wound up going to Zachary. There was a child who was forced to clean up her feces.
Yes, that one became a national story.
A national story. There were a lot of people in Zachary that were upset with the story that we wound up doing. And
what do you mean?
They were upset
that it happened, or that you talked about it?
They were upset that we did the story, and essentially people in the community, not us, identified who the individuals were. misidentified
I talked about that.
They misidentified.
Go into that, because you and I were chatting about this in your office a couple of weeks ago. Okay, go through that.
So we wound up getting this tip that this child was forced to clean up feces at Rollins Place Elementary School after she had a dairy allergy. So we go interview the mom. Call the superintendent, call the administrators. The superintendent verifies everything that the mom says. We put a story to air. He says, the adults have been talked to. This is not going to happen again. And, we're moving forward. We've learned our lesson, basically, confirming everything the mom says.
Sure.
So we air the story, blows up, unbelievably. We were not planning to do any additional stories.
Right.
But then Zachary Schools keeps issuing statements. The following day, they issued another statement after the enormous blowback that they got following our story. Then later that week, they issue another statement. And so it continued the news cycle, because we thought it was going to be a one and done after the superintendent said, hey, look, we've addressed this. We're moving forward. But then after they say they've now opened an internal investigation, and then once there was a criminal investigation with police, then this continues the news cycle, right? Well, one thing we cannot control is we cannot control what people say on social media.
Right.
So even though we were responsible by not identifying any of the adults involved, people went in and assumed there were certain people that were involved and then posted their pictures, and then ultimately they wound up getting some heat for that.
Yeah,
we can't control that.
But that's... So I think Heather and I were talking about that, downstairs. That's the thing that I didn't understand, because obviously you did not identify.
Never.
Obviously you wouldn't identify the child or the mother or anything like that. And somebody who may be, so where is that now? The fact that people were being critical of the story about knowing who the child and the parent, are, but that didn't come from AFB.
No, it did not. It came from other individuals in the community that posted their pictures and their names on there. But again, like anytime we do a story, we don't censor what people say on social, and especially if it's being shared on other people's Facebook pages, we can't control other people's Facebook pages.
Were they in the comment section? Or did they share the story and identify who the people were?
Shared the story and then identified them on their own pages.
Yeah.
So we cannot control that.
No.
Of course we can censor comments on our pages. Yeah. And there were a couple of people that tried to identify them, and I quickly, remove those comments. But we cannot control what other people do on their social media pages. So we're in this digital revolution. Yeah. It's great because information is at your fingertips, but also too, it creates a situation where you have to be very cognizant of where you're getting the information from. And if there's a reason why a news organization didn't identify somebody, there's probably a good reason for that. And so we were very responsible in our reporting, didn't identify anybody. But again, we cannot control what people do on social media.
Man, how do you navigate that now? I mean, it's changing so rapidly. How do you navigate that particular aspect? This town isn't as big as people think it is. So you run a story, you're trying to protect the anonymity of someone who's either giving you a tip or has information, and then someone says, "Oh, I recognized her or him. That's so and so." There's nothing you can do about that.
There's nothing we can do about it, but I think it also goes back and speaks to the fact that you have to be getting your information from reputable places. Reading something on Facebook is not necessarily going to be accurate.
I tell Chuck that all the time.
We heard it from Baton Rouge Police Chief TJ Morse. I asked the question during the news conference last week. There were only 3 people arrested for Caleb's hazing and the hazing that night, and 3 warrants. But there was this rumor out there that there were going to be 10 arrests. Yeah. And it was being perpetuated as recent as this week. Yeah. And that's not the case at all.
Well, again, he talked about it on television, and you just elaborated on it here about, because when I was able to understand why the other kids weren't talked to, and that there was corroborating information that validates that those kids were taken into another room. And then it's still an ongoing investigation. So there may be more arrests, just not arrests of people who were in that room, depending on who else knew that this was going to happen or did happen and didn't say anything. And so the fact that the investigation is open and that you are here in Baton Rouge should make some people a little bit nervous. Let's talk about what's coming up, like it's things that you've got in the hopper. You told me as of this week, when the show airs, you've got a story that's going up.
Yeah, so we have a story that's going to be airing this upcoming week. It essentially involves a state official who had the authority to sign contracts for the agency that he worked at. And ultimately, he has a cozy relationship with the contractor. This contractor winds up setting up this company. And within months of him setting up this company, starts getting a lot of these no-bid contracts. Some of them were bid, but some of them were over $500,000. And so you're a business person. You understand that you don't just set up a company and within 3 months start getting enormous contracts like that.
Well, because there's so many metrics about experience and what you can provide. And if you're brand new, it's really hard to be able to justify that you can versus companies that have been around for a long time.
Right. So we interviewed a public policy professor and he says, this isn't good for anyone. It's not good for Louisiana. It's not good for economic development, because you'll have other businesses that are looking at this and they'll say, why should I relocate to Louisiana when this type of behavior is happening here? So it really is a snowball effect when you look at it. Did they break any laws? No, that's not the point of the story. But to the public professor's point, public policy professor's point, just because a law wasn't broken doesn't mean there's not an appearance of impropriety or the good old boy network. And I think that's kind of what we're trying to avoid here in Louisiana. We've made a lot of headway and ground in terms of that. But when you have situations like these that continue to perpetuate themselves, it raises questions about how far have we really come.
What's your goal? We talked about this, I think, early on when it didn't come back when you started here on AFB. But what's your goal with the I-Team interacting with the public, both the governmental public and the average everyday Baton Rougean? What are you hoping to accomplish?
I think what we are trying to accomplish is being a voice for the little guy, exposing any sort of injustice, because ultimately things don't happen until we get a phone call. Usually they've exhausted all possibilities. They're tired. They call us, we make some calls, we expose the situation, and then magically stuff happens. For example, there was a teacher at Estruma High School. She'd been fighting with the school system since August. She was assaulted at school. There was no one disputing the fact that she was assaulted at school by a parent. The parent was arrested. There is a law in Louisiana that says you get assault pay if you're assaulted and you're a teacher. But until she wound up doing an interview with us, that assault pay was withheld from her. Why did it take us doing a story for her to get what's in the law?
Why was it withheld?
They said that there were some paperwork errors and some glitches, the standard answers that you would expect to hear. But it's amazing that the minute we do the story that all of that is all of a sudden cleaned up and she can get the pay that was on the books to begin with. And I should say back pay to August.
Okay.
So it's just, I think it's stories like that when we can do something that shines a light where there are shadows, it just keeps people on their toes. And I tell people all the time, the best way to not make the news is don't do something that's going to make us want to put you on the news.
Right.
You know what I mean? Well, don't do silly things and you won't make the news.
It's so funny. When were you still? Did you get to BRZ when Paul Gates was here doing it?
Yeah.
So you remember, and because we all watched Paul Gates, and Paul Gates was for the longest time legend. For the longest time, he was that guy that the little guy called, a lady who got stiffed on a car purchase or some work at a house didn't happen, or some kind of wrongful termination or money being withheld like you just talked about. And he held that designation for so long. And I feel like you've moved into that space now where people who aren't necessarily looking to be on the news, but are looking for some kind of resolution to an issue. And I think that's special, but it is a big responsibility. How do you handle that?
It is a big responsibility. And let me just say this too. There are plenty of tips that we've gotten where we've made a phone call.
You vet it.
And not only do we make the phone call, the agency or public entity made it right and it never made the news.
Right.
So like just because we wind up doing something or talking to somebody about a tip and asking a question doesn't mean it's going to be a news story.
That's valuable.
It's valuable because sometimes it takes us just making the phone call and asking the question for them to say, okay, well, there was nothing malicious here. Right. We just, need to get our paperwork straight or whatever. And then it happens. And then we don't do a story on it.
Well, I love that. So two things. One, we talked about this when you did the C-suite before, but I want to kind of go back to it again. You get a phone call about something. Someone makes an accusation. And then you vet it and you realize that's garbage. That didn't happen. Where someone tries to weaponize the I-Team's broad reach for their own personal gain, but it isn't really legitimate. I know that happens. You don't have to go into any specific examples,
Yeah.
but just kind of talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, we know that, certainly some tips. I mean, there was a tip that I got, probably last fall, and I have been working on it, chasing it down. And I think here recently, within the last couple of weeks, we determined there's not a story here until we can get one more element. And I don't think that element's going to come. So we're kind of shelving that story. Probably, I call it a cold case. It'll be a cold case, sitting in the back file until we can get that element. But I don't think that element's going to come. So, but I mean, that just shows you like the level of work that we're doing. Like some of these stories we're working on for months.
Yeah.
And even though we're working on them, they're in various stages of development. Some of them, I mean, I feel like I've wasted a lot of time on that story, which is unfortunate. But at the same time, too, we have a responsibility, as you said, to not weaponize what we're doing, because there's so much ammunition now to question what we're doing as fake news.
Yes.
So we have to go above and beyond to make sure we're doing our due diligence and that everything's accurate.
So I talked to someone last week, and I was explaining that you have a process, because this situation that happened with Caleb touched so many people and entities.
Yes.
And there were people who became defensive, not because they didn't care about this young man, but there were entire entities being kind of lumped in with the activity that took this young man's life. And somebody brought up one of your reports and said, but look, nothing makes the air without being checked multiple times. He just won't do it. He won't just throw it up there.
Yeah.
Now, unfortunately, as you know, others in the industry are not as thorough. And I don't have anybody specifically here in Baton Rouge in mind when I say that.
Sure.
Let me just put that out there. But overall, we've known about the weaponization of media, and that is not true to the virtue of what this is supposed to be, correct?
I look at it like this. Like, the last thing that I want to do is go on the air and apologize for something that I said that was inaccurate.
Right.
So if there's any doubt that what I'm about to report is inaccurate, we're just not going to do the story.
Right.
And like, at my old station, it was the same way. This station's the same way. Nobody wants to report inaccurate information.
Right.
So I think from that perspective, like, Baton Rouge is very blessed, to have a news organization like WAFB here that does its due diligence and makes sure that before we go on the air that, everything's going to be vetted and factual. There's certain sources that I have. Like, if you called me right now, I would go downstairs in the studio and front verbatim what they said. There are other sources that I have that I know that if I get a call, I'm going to have to verify it with 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 other people to make sure it's accurate.
Right.
The story and the tip that we got from Caleb was 100% verifiable. I felt comfortable going on the air with that allegation, but I knew it was so outlandish.
Yeah.
I wanted to just get one more person. And when the second person verified exactly what the first person said, that I would have felt comfortable going on the air anyway, I said,
yeah,
it's a done deal. Like, this is what happened to him.
Sad all the way around, and it's a shame because we've had many high-profile hazing deaths over the last decade, and Max Gruber was what, 2017?
Yeah, 2017.
So it's really terrible. I don't think I've ever asked you this question, and it's kind of a profession question. Because of the unique designation you have here, a lot of people who are either on the way to or in journalism school see what you're doing. What's your advice to someone who is either an influencer or someone coming into the industry about how to be effective? Success is subjective, but how to be effective?
You have to be a good listener. Being a good listener means you're listening to what people are saying. It's one thing to just be able to get some facts and put it out there. You have to talk to people and you have to listen. Oftentimes, you may have a preconceived notion of how a story's going to go, but if you're not listening to what they're saying, you might be missing the whole point of what they're trying to say. And so that's my biggest advice to people who are in journalism school that may want to do this. Like, you have to be inquisitive, number one, and you have to be intelligent. You have to be well-read. Like, this is not a glamorous job. People may see us on TV.
Yeah.
Coming into work every day, being on TV is the last thing I think about.
Yeah.
It's getting our facts right, making sure we have all the elements we need, and then going to present a fair story. But you have to be a good listener, because if you're not listening to what the people are saying, you might be missing the whole point of the story.
You're so spot on. It's like, I'm in here one day a week. I tape both the podcast and the TV show on the same day. And sometimes I'll have my cards with me because there's so many numbers I have. I just can't, like I used to be able to, keep 12 different analytics in my head. But normally I don't. And the reason is I spend so much time in prep.
Yep.
And I really don't ever script questions. I have areas I want to go into because, to your point, when I'm listening to a guest say something, and you and I are colleagues, and so it's a little bit different.
Mm-hmm.
But when I'm interviewing someone about a story, man, they may say something that you didn't think about or you didn't know was coming. It's like, wait, what? Say that again?
Yeah.
And I think that is a value. And I find if you're overly dependent on questions and you're waiting for what question's next when an answer is going on, you don't know what you might have missed.
Right. 100%. I tell people all the time when an interview subject asks me, can you send me a list of questions? I say, I like to keep my interviews dialogue.
Right.
So I'll maybe give you an outline on topics we may cover, but like I certainly don't want to pigeonhole myself into these 4 questions.
No.
And then you say something totally different that I wasn't thinking about, and the story changes directions. And now I'm pigeonholed into these questions that I told you I was going to ask.
Yeah.
Because the last thing you want is for that person to then go on social media or whatever avenues they have and then tell, oh, this person set up this interview under false pretenses.
Right.
These are the questions that they said they were going to ask, and they asked me X, Y, Z.
Look, man, I didn't give the governor questions.
Yes.
When the governor came in, I said, here are the subjects we're going to cover. Can't send you questions. And you talk about listening. Chuck could attest. I interviewed one of the lead investigators in the OJ murder trial, and he talked like 3.5 straight minutes.
Yes.
And I let him go because there was so much protein in what he was saying, because you're on television pretty much every day. The subject of your interview may not be on with you tomorrow, or the subject of your story. So it should be more the subject than you, right?
100%. I agree with that. And now they have avenues. So now everyone's got social media pages, and they've got X and Instagram and stuff like that. So if you're setting up an interview and saying the interview's about this, and these are the only questions I'm going to ask, you're really doing yourself a disservice as a journalist, because you're not listening to what the person's saying. You're only worried about your questions.
He is the best, ladies and gentlemen, lead investigator, Chris Nakamoto. He's an investigative reporter, but he does a little bit more than that, and keeping up the great work. And you can catch some of his reporting, not just on the website, but it's on YouTube as well, some of the stuff that's been done. And so they're doing a great job of putting content up. Any final thoughts about the Wilson thing before we wrap up?
Yeah, I'll just say this. It got an enormous amount of traction. And so if you want to see some of the stories, if you haven't seen them, there's a hazing tab on the WAFB.com website. And you can go there and see all the stories that we did from the beginning, when his body was first found, to what we exposed, to we had exclusive walk video of all 3 suspects. One, Kyle Thurman, being transported to jail from Port Allen. We have Caleb McCrae coming out of the East Baton Rouge Parish Jail. He's the one that police say punched Wilson. And then, of course, we have Isaiah Smith, who was the Dean of Pledges, being walked out of the Violent Crimes Unit, all exclusive to WAFB. You can see their videos, and we also have their mugshots there.
Like you said earlier, absolutely no winners.
No winners.
Not one. Well, we're a winner being able to talk with this guy and have him do work here in our community, Chris Nakamoto. Next week's edition of the C-Suite, Chris, will be from Alec Box Stadium.
Ooh, nice.
Our guest will be baseball coach Jay Johnson. Can't wait to do that. We're taking these on the road. You know, we're going to do, I mentioned this to the chief, and I got to get you to come here. One of our on-location shows are going to be at the Real-Time Crime Center at BRPD.
Sweet.
I'd like you to tag along on that one.
Yeah.
Of course, the building might empty out when Chris walks into it. We'll catch you next week on the C-Suite. Thank you, Chuck. You guys have a great week.